Here is a fact that people who lived through the Troubles sometimes have to be shown twice before they accept it. The Ulster Defence Association, the largest Loyalist paramilitary organisation in Northern Ireland, tens of thousands of members at its height, responsible for more than 400 deaths, was a legal organisation until August 1992. Not tolerated, not overlooked. Legal. You could be a card-carrying member and say so publicly. It had offices. It had a named leadership structure. It gave press interviews and marched through the streets of Belfast carrying Union flags. In 1974, when the Ulster Workers' Council strike brought down the Sunningdale power-sharing agreement, the UDA provided much of the paramilitary muscle, openly, as a lawful body. Meanwhile, across the city, membership of the IRA had been a criminal offence for decades. The Civil Authorities Special Powers Act of 1922 had criminalised it. The Northern Ireland Emergency Provisions Acts of 1973 and 1978 reenacted those provisions. The Prevention of Terrorism Act of 1989 listed IRA membership as punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Both organisations were killing people. The state was treating them as fundamentally different kinds of problem. And it was doing that on the basis of an assessment it wrote down. In 2006, the British Army produced an internal document, Operation Banner, Army Code 71842, a retrospective analysis of its 37-year military campaign in Northern Ireland. When it leaked, the Irish Times reported its contents in July 2007. What the Army had written about the Provisional IRA was precise and considered. The organisation was described as professional, dedicated, highly skilled and resilient, and as one of the most effective terrorist organisations in history. When it turned to the Loyalist paramilitaries, the Irish Times reported a different register entirely. What the army described there wasn't a strategic opponent. The Loyalists were often, in the document's reported language, little more than a collection of gangsters. Two enemies, two verdicts. Almost everything that went wrong in this conflict, the agents, the collusion findings, the 13 years of Stevens' inquiries, flows from the gap between those two sentences. A viewer left a comment on this channel's second most watched video. 33 likes and 10 replies, the most agreed with thing anyone has posted here. His name is on screen now. He put the British Army's words about the IRA next to what it reportedly wrote about the Loyalists and left the two sentences sitting side by side without adding a word. No editorial, just the contrast. This video is the answer to that comment. The single boundary is this. The video isn't about which community suffered more. It's about one institutional judgment and its downstream consequences. The Ulster Volunteer Force and the Ulster Defence Association weren't the same organisation. They were distinct in origin, culture and discipline, and by the late 1990s they were lethally hostile to each other. That distinction matters throughout. The UVF came first. Formed in May 1966 in Belfast, led initially by Gusty Spence, a former Royal Ulster Rifles soldier from the Shankill Road, it named itself after the Ulster Volunteer Force of 1912, the Protestant militia that had resisted Home Rule, whose volunteers formed the 36th Ulster Division. On the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 36th Ulster Division suffered catastrophic casualties. That date became the centre of a commemorative identity the modern UVF explicitly claimed. The self-conception was of a defensive military force with a historical lineage reaching back to a genuine sacrifice. Steve Bruce's 1992 study, The Red Hand, published by Oxford University Press, and the Standard's scholarly account of Protestant paramilitarism, characterized the UVF as smaller, more cohesive, and more militarily organized than the UDA. Stricter internal hierarchy, a policy of limited and selective membership, a clearer ideological self-conception. At its peak in the 1970s, the UVF numbered around 1,500 members, with a hard core of perhaps 400 to 500 active gunmen and bombers. It was proscribed within weeks of its founding. In June 1966, after UVF members shot dead a Catholic civilian on Malvern Street in Belfast and wounded 2 others, the Northern Ireland government declared the UVF illegal under the Civil Authorities Special Powers Act. This was a devolved government action. Harold Wilson made supportive statements at Westminster, but the legal instrument was Northern Ireland's own legislation. Gusty Spence was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The UDA's trajectory was entirely different. Formed in September 1971 as an umbrella for Protestant vigilante groups, the Shankill Defence Association, the Woodvale Defence Association, and others, it grew at a pace the UVF never approached. By 1972, the UDA was claiming upwards of 40,000 members. Britannica places the peak between 15,000 and 40,000, which is itself an indication of how difficult precise figures were to establish. Treat those numbers as estimates with a wide margin. Charles Harding Smith became the dominant early figure. Andy Tyree succeeded him as Supreme Commander in 1973 and held that position until 1988. The communities the UDA recruited from were under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. Deindustrialization was hollowing out Protestant working-class Belfast through the 1970s. The shipbuilding and linen industries that had anchored the Shankill and similar areas were contracting sharply. Unemployment ran well above the Northern Ireland average. IRA bombs were hitting Protestant businesses and Protestant workers. Steve Bruce's analysis in The Red Hand identified the sense of community under threat, from Republican violence, from a political process negotiating over their heads, from economic collapse, as the recruitment engine. That context explains the scale of the organization. It does not explain or excuse what the organization did with that scale. The key structural fact: the UDA remained legal from its founding until August 1992. 21 years. In January 1991, Northern Ireland Minister Dr. Brian Mulroney had set out the formal government criterion for prescription. An organisation must be primarily and actively engaged in criminal terrorist acts. The government's position was that only the UFF, the cover name, met that test, while the UDA didn't. Size was also a factor. Banning an organisation with tens of thousands of members was considered politically and operationally problematic. Earlier NIO internal papers record concerns about driving members toward more extreme, already prescribed groups. By 1992, that reasoning was almost entirely fictitious. The cover name had been invented, in the account of Loyalist John White, specifically so that UDA members could claim killings while the parent organisation kept its legal status. In May 1972, the UDA's leadership decided that responsibility for acts of violence would be claimed under a different name: the Ulster Freedom Fighters. The UFF wasn't a separate organisation. It had no separate membership and no separate command structure. A 1992 NIO briefing paper, subsequently declassified, stated this without qualification. The UFF comprised no more than a cover name for the violent acts of UDA members. The same paper added, Nobody believes that the UFF and the UDA are distinct organisations. Nor do we. The UFF was proscribed as a terrorist organisation in November 1973. The UDA wasn't. The practical result? During those 21 years? A person could be an openly identified UDA member, legal, claim a killing in the name of the Ulster freedom fighters, illegal, and continue as a UDA member the next morning, still legal. Security forces understood this. Journalists understood it. The NIO understood it. The fiction was maintained as a deliberate policy choice. On the 10th of August 1992, Secretary of State Sir Patrick Mayhew announced the UDA would be proscribed from midnight that night under Section 28(3) of the Northern Ireland Emergency Provisions Act 1991. His statement: "I am satisfied that the UDA is actively and primarily engaged in the commission of criminal, terrorist acts, and so merits prescription under the provisions of the Emergency Provisions Act. For these purposes, it acts as the Ulster Freedom Fighters." The order took legal effect at the start of the 11th of August 1992. 21 years after its formation, the legal cover was gone. The question of what the Loyalist campaign actually consisted of has to be answered from the data, not from argument. The source is Lost Lives, David McKittrick, Seamus Kelters, Brian Feeney and Chris Thornton, published by Mainstream in 1999 and updated in 2007. It's the acknowledged standard reference for Trouble's casualties. That book and those authors are on screen now. Loyalist paramilitaries were responsible for approximately 28 to 30% of all deaths in the Troubles, roughly 1,100 people by the best available count. Republican paramilitaries were responsible for approximately 58 to 60%. State security forces account for about 10%. These proportions are consistent across multiple independent analyses of the same underlying data. The composition of those Loyalist killings tells the more specific story. Lancaster University's Troubled Geographies analysis found that Catholic civilians represented 67% of Loyalist victims across both main organisations. Kane estimates that Loyalist paramilitaries killed almost half of all Catholics who died during the entire Troubles. These weren't accidental proportions. They were the consistent pattern of the campaign. The Loyalist organisations offered a strategic rationale for this. Killing Catholics would pressure the nationalist community to withdraw support from the IRA, making the Republican campaign politically unsustainable. The UDA's official position described its own role in the event of British withdrawal as acting as the IRA in reverse. Some academic work produced after the conflict has argued this logic had a coherence of its own, that raising the cost of IRA activity to the nationalist community may have contributed indirectly to the peace process. The Army's analysis didn't credit it as a military strategy. The argument implicit in Operation Banner and explicit in Steve Bruce's scholarship in The Red Hand was that the target set was inconsistent with the stated objective. If the goal was to degrade the IRA's operational capacity, killing random Catholic civilians with no paramilitary connection didn't achieve it. The IRA's campaign continued and intensified through the peak years of Loyalist killing. An organisation that kills civilians at roughly 9-1 against combatants, that does not attack military infrastructure, that does not meaningfully reduce the enemy's operational capacity, from a military analytical perspective, that isn't a strategic campaign in any recognised sense. The NIO's 1992 briefing paper called the UDA essentially a criminal conspiracy aimed at killing, often indiscriminately, members of the minority community. Operation Banner, as reported by the Irish Times from the leaked document, described what Loyalist paramilitaries had become as often little more than a collection of gangsters. That characterization wasn't morally neutral, and it wasn't without consequence. The Pat Finucane Centre argued in 2007 that Operation Banner had airbrushed out the full scale of Loyalist violence from the Army's own retrospective account. That observation cuts both ways. If the assessment was that Loyalists were a criminal problem rather than a strategic opponent, the institutional incentive to analyse them rigorously was correspondingly lower. And lower analysis meant lower scrutiny of the people operating inside those organisations. By the early 1990s, the Lower Shankill, a small, dense residential area of West Belfast, had become the base for the most active Loyalist unit in Northern Ireland. C Company was the Shankill Road subunit of the 2nd Battalion of the UDA's West Belfast Brigade. From October 1990, its commander was Johnny Adair. Adair was born on the 27th October 1963 and grew up in the Lower Shankill. By March 1993, he had become brigadier of the entire West Belfast Brigade. Under his direction, C Company's operational tempo escalated sharply. RUC detectives attributed responsibility for up to about 40 killings to C Company in the early 1990s, mostly Catholic civilians. That is police attribution, not a court verdict. Adair himself was never convicted of murder. 3 categories of information about him must be held separately. The court record is what Belfast Crown Court established as legal fact. Adair's own accounts, available in his interviews with the Good Listener podcast, linked in the description and worth hearing at length rather than being summarised here, represent what he has said about himself. Police attributions and journalistic estimates describe what was suspected about C Company without being established against Adair personally in court. What follows distinguishes between those categories throughout. The court record. RUC undercover officers recorded months of conversations with Adair through 1994. In those recordings, he boasted about paramilitary activities. During subsequent court proceedings, he admitted having been a UDA leader for 3 years, up to 1994. On 16th of May 1994, approximately 20 leading C Company members were arrested. On 6th of September 1995, at Belfast Crown Court, Adair pleaded guilty to directing terrorism under Section 29 of the Northern Ireland Emergency Provisions Act, not the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which contained no equivalent provision. An Irish court later described it as an unprecedented charge in Northern Ireland. The sentence was 16 years, with a concurrent 7-year term for membership of an illegal organisation. C Company's lead gunman was Stephen McKegg, known as Top Gun. Police attributed at least 12 murders to McKegg personally. He was never convicted of murder. He died in September 2000. Adair had a public profile that distinguished him from most paramilitary commanders. He gave interviews. He was photographed. A Guardian newspaper profile, published shortly before the Shankill Road bombing, in which he spoke freely about UDA operations, subsequently provided the IRA's planners with additional urgency for the attack they were already preparing. From the perspective of both the security forces and the IRA, it was a category error, a commander who made himself visible. On 14th of September 1999, Adair was released as the 293rd prisoner freed under the Northern Ireland Sentences Act 1998, the Good Friday Agreement's early release scheme. This wasn't an amnesty, it was a licence with conditions attached. Peter Mandelson revoked it in August 2000 on the basis that Adair had remained involved in terrorism and criminal activity. He was released again in May 2002. His licence was revoked a second time by Paul Murphy in January 2003. Adair was formally expelled from the UDA in September 2002, not 2003, which appears in some accounts and is wrong. The inner council meeting was in Sandy Row. 5 days later, the public announcement. He was no longer acceptable in our organisation. The stated reasons included his ties to the Loyalist volunteer force, which was at active war with the UVF, and his attempts to consolidate personal control over UDA structures across Belfast. In February 2003, hundreds of UDA members took over the lower Shankill. Adair's wife Gina, their children, and approximately 20 supporters left Northern Ireland by ferry, settling near Bolton in Horwich, a grouping that acquired the nickname the Bolton Wanderers. Adair served the remainder of his sentence and was released on the 10th of January 2005. 23rd of October 1993. Saturday, shortly after 1 p.m. Two men in deliveryman's clothing carried a holdall toward Frizzell's fish shop at 271 Shankill Road, around the corner from Berlin Street. Inside, it was a bomb. The UDA's West Belfast Brigade headquarters was in the room above the fish shop. The inner council met there on Saturday mornings. The IRA's Belfast Brigade had the building under surveillance. The operation was intended to kill the UDA leadership. A scout had spotted Adair entering the building that morning, and this had confirmed the go-ahead. The two men were Thomas Begley, 22, and Sean Kelly, also in his early 20s, both from Ardoyne. Begley was to carry the bomb to the serving counter, warn the customers, and leave before the fuse expired. The device was designed to direct its blast upward through the floor. Begley moved through the customers toward the counter. The bomb detonated prematurely while he was holding it over the refrigerated serving counter. 10 people died. The convention used here 9 victims and 1 bomber. The victims were John Frizzell, 63, his daughter Sharon McBride, 29, Leanne Murray, 13, Michael Morrison, 27, a UDA member, his partner Evelyn Baird, 27, their daughter Michelle, 7, George Williamson, 63, his wife Gillian, 49, and Wilma McKee, 38. Thomas Begley died in the explosion. 57 people were injured. Sean Kelly survived, losing his left eye. The UDA meeting had already ended. Those who attended had left before the bomb went off. Adair had been in the building that morning. He was gone by the time it detonated. 2 days after the bombing, a police officer reported Adair stopping his car and saying, "I'm away to plan a mass murder." Sean Kelly was convicted of 9 counts of murder in January 1995. He was released in July 2000 under the Good Friday Agreement. 14 civilians were killed in Loyalist reprisals over the days that followed. The afternoon of the bombing, a Catholic delivery driver lured to a false call in Belfast, shot dead. He died on the 25th of October. 26th of October, 2 Catholic civilians shot dead at a council depot on Kennedy Way, 5 more wounded. 30th of October 1993, Greysteel, County Londonderry. The Rising Sun Bar, Halloween night. At least 70 people inside. 3 men entered wearing blue boiler suits and balaclavas. Stephen Irwin opened fire on the packed lounge, shouting, "Trick or treat!" as he did. Jeffrey Deeney's weapon jammed after 1 shot. Torrens Knight guarded the entrance. 7 people died at the scene. An 8th died of wounds. 19 were injured. The dead: Karen Thompson, 19, Stephen Mullen, 20, Moira Duddy, 59, Joseph McDermott, 60, James Moore, 81, John Moyne, 50, John Burns, 54, Victor Montgomery, 76, 6 Catholic civilians and 2 Protestant civilians. The UDA claimed the attack the following day under the Ulster Freedom Fighters cover name. Their statement said it was the continuation of our threats against the nationalist electorate that they would pay a heavy price for last Saturday's slaughter of 9 Protestants. A West Belfast UDA member added that his organisation had information that senior IRA men drank in the rising sun. Unfortunately, they weren't there on Halloween. In February 1995, Irwin, Deany, Knight and their driver Brian McNeil were each sentenced to life imprisonment. In 2000, they were released under the Good Friday Agreement. Irwin later told a reporter he had no remorse. 1 week. A fish shop on the Shankill Road. A bar in rural County Londonderry. 24 dead. The great majority had no connection to any armed organisation in either direction. The collusion record has to be stated precisely because it's routinely misrepresented in both directions. Brian Nelson was born in Belfast in 1947. He served in the British Army's Black Watch Regiment and joined the UDA after his discharge. In 1974, he was convicted of the kidnapping and torture of Gerald Higgins, a partially sighted Catholic man who died shortly afterwards. Nelson served approximately 3 years of a 7-year sentence. By the mid-1980s, he was back inside UDA structures. The British Army's Force Research Unit, the FRU, was running him as a covert agent, codenamed 6137. His role within the UDA was intelligence officer. He gathered information on prospective targets, compiled and updated files on them, and passed that information to UDA gunmen. He used carpet-fitting work as cover for reconnaissance in nationalist areas. In some cases, his FRU handlers were supplying him with information derived from security force databases that fed into UDA targeting files. The most publicly established case associated with Nelson's role is the killing of solicitor Patrick Finucane on the 12th of February 1989, shot dead at his home in North Belfast. The Ulster freedom fighters claimed it. Subsequent investigations connected the killing to information passed from within the RUC Special Branch. Nelson was arrested during the first Stevens inquiry in 1990. In February 1992, he pleaded guilty to 5 counts of conspiracy to murder and 14 counts of possessing information likely to be useful to terrorists. He was sentenced to 10 years. At sentencing, Defense Secretary Tom King described him in open court as a valuable agent. Nelson died in April 2003. Some material relating to his case has never been published. The Stevens inquiries ran across 3 separate investigations. The first began in 1989. During that inquiry, the incident room at Carrickfergus was destroyed by fire, an event John Stevens later described publicly as deeply suspicious. The second inquiry followed in 1990. The third produced an overview and recommendations report on the 17th of April 2003. Its central finding was stated in direct terms. I conclude there was collusion in both murders and the circumstances surrounding them. That is the finding. Collusion occurred, in specific cases involving specific individuals in the security forces and the Loyalist organisations. The Stevens report didn't conclude that the British state held an explicit policy of directing Loyalist paramilitaries as a matter of official intent. What it found was that collusion happened, that it wasn't prevented when it should have been, and that agents were run inside Loyalist organisations in ways that allowed, or failed to prevent, killings. The gap between what has been published and what remains in closed material isn't small. What the pattern of Stevens' findings is consistent with is this. Agents inside Loyalist organisations were run under significantly less rigorous oversight than agents inside the IRA. The threshold for intervention was higher. The scrutiny applied to what those agents were enabling was lower. The question of what they might be facilitating received less sustained institutional attention than the stakes required. Operation Banner was produced in 2006, a retrospective, not a policy instrument from the 1970s. The Army's verdict on the IRA was a retrospective assessment, not the cause of how Loyalists were treated in real time. But the pattern of that real-time treatment, the legal status, the resourcing decisions, the agent running oversight, was consistent with the verdict the Army later wrote down. The UDA spent 21 years as a legal organisation because, at every point where the question was formally reviewed, the institutional judgment was that it didn't yet meet the threshold of a primary threat requiring full counterinsurgency resources. When that same institution assessed the IRA, it reached a different conclusion, allocated different resources, and applied different levels of scrutiny to the people it ran inside it. There is a question left in this channel's comments. No likes recorded when it was posted, no reply given, asking why nobody talks about the Shankill Butchers. The Shankill Butchers were a UVF unit active between approximately 1975 and 1982, based on the Shankill Road in Belfast. Their leader was Lenny Murphy. Martin Dillon's 1989 Hutchinson study, The Shankill Butchers, a case study of mass murder, is the primary documented account. The group is attributed with at least 30 murders. Murphy was shot dead by the IRA in November 1982, 4 months after his release from the Maze prison. The specific nature of how this unit operated won't be described here. It requires its own video, and it will get one. That comment, left without a like or a reply, is the reason it will. The gap between the two sentences in the Army's document isn't just a rhetorical contrast. It's where the institutional logic of 21 years of policy becomes visible. When a state decides that one armed group is a strategic threat and another is a criminal problem, it does not just think about them differently. It resources them differently. It watches them differently. It runs agents inside them differently, and it supervises those agents differently. And 30 years later, there are inquiries still working through exactly how differently. The people killed by Loyalist paramilitaries were, in the overwhelming majority, civilians. According to Lost Lives, approximately 85% of Loyalist victims were non-combatants, mostly Catholic civilians with no connection to any armed group. That isn't an argument. It's in the record, and it's the reason the Army wrote what it wrote about the organisations that killed them. But the judgment had a consequence that nobody put in the document. If you decide a thing isn't a serious threat, you stop watching it as carefully as you should. What specifically did the Army's assessment fail to foresee? Not whether it was right to assess the IRA as the primary threat. There is no serious version of this conflict in which that conclusion was wrong. The question is narrower. What were the downstream effects of treating the other side as the lesser problem? What did lower scrutiny cost, and who paid it? That is the question worth leaving in the comments. It's worth more than a verdict from here. Subscribe below for more of this kind of work.